My name is Sera Vance, and I am a 29-year-old lead quantitative auditor for Sterling and Associates, one of the most ruthless forensic accounting firms in the heart of Chicago's Loop. People in my profession are paid to find the ghosts in the machines, the missing pennies that turn into millions, and the cold, hard truths hidden behind layers of offshore accounts and shell companies. But no audit I have ever performed was as chilling as the sound of my own father's voice vibrating through the high-definition speakers of a Polycom conference phone at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. "Mr. Sterling, your senior analyst Sera Vance is a thief," my father, Arthur Vance, boomed, his voice carrying that familiar, practiced tone of aristocratic authority he used when ordering a dry martini or demanding a subordinate's resignation. "I have proof she embezzled $450,000 from our family trust to fund her lifestyle," he continued, the lie rolling off his tongue with a terrifying smoothness. "Fire her before she guts your firm, too." I sat perfectly still in the ergonomic Herman Miller Aeron chair across from Marcus Sterling, my hands folded neatly on the polished mahogany surface of the desk. I didn't tremble. I didn't gasp. I simply watched the tiny digital recorder on the desk spin, capturing every syllable of the character assassination being broadcast from a 3-car garage in the suburbs of Lake Forest. My father had no idea that I was sitting right there in the CEO's office, or that Marcus Sterling, a man who values data over blood, was looking at me with a mixture of professional curiosity and silent sympathy. The irony of the situation was as heavy as the custom-tailored charcoal wool blazer I wore. My father was accusing me of theft because I had finally committed the ultimate sin in the Vance household. I had said no. 2 weeks ago, at a dinner at the Ocean Prime on Wacker Drive where the bill for 4 people surpassed $1,200, my father had leaned across the table, his breath smelling of expensive Macallan 18, and demanded that I liquidate my $82,000 401k. He didn't ask. He informed me that the funds were needed to bridge a financing gap for my younger sister Chloe's failing business, Ethereal Glow, an organic candle boutique that was currently hemorrhaging $30,000 a month in rent for a storefront in the West Loop that nobody visited. He told me it was my duty as the elder, successful daughter to subsidize Chloe's creative journey, regardless of the fact that I had spent 7 years working 80-hour weeks, surviving on black coffee and spreadsheets, to build that nest egg. When I calmly explained that my retirement fund was not a slush fund for a hobby that produced overpriced wax, he looked at me as if I were a defect in the family manufacturing line. Now, here he was, attempting to execute a professional death sentence because I refused to let him cannibalize my future to feed Chloe's delusions. But before I take you into the wreckage of what happened next, you need to understand that I wasn't always the cold, calculating auditor who keeps a recording of her father's betrayal. I grew up in a house where love was a performance metric and attention was the primary currency, usually reserved for Chloe. Our home in Lake Forest was a sprawling 6-bedroom Tudor revival with a meticulously manicured lawn and a driveway that always held a revolving door of luxury vehicles, currently a 2024 Mercedes-Maybach S-Class that my father insisted on driving even though his manufacturing firm, Vance Global Logistics, was secretly drowning in debt. My childhood was a series of lessons in invisibility. If Chloe won a middle school talent show, the family went to Paris. If I finished my master's in accounting with a 4.0 GPA from Northwestern, I was told it was the bare minimum expected of someone with my last name. My parents, Arthur and Madeline, lived by a strict code of social optics. Everything had to look perfect, even if the foundation was rotting. The contrast was always sharp and painful. While Chloe was gifted a brand new 2023 BMW 4 Series convertible for her 24th birthday, I was still driving the 2018 Honda Civic. I had bought myself with my first internship paycheck, a car my mother refused to let me park in the front driveway because it ruined the aesthetic of the neighborhood. That Tuesday morning in Marcus Sterling's office, the air smelled of expensive leather and the faint ozone scent of high-end air purifiers. Marcus reached out and tapped the mute button on the conference phone with a manicured finger, his eyes never leaving mine. "Sera, do you want to respond to this?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. I took a slow breath, feeling the cool air fill my lungs. "No, Marcus," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through my veins. "Let him finish. I want every lie on that tape." We sat in silence for another 3 minutes as my father detailed a fictionalized account of my greed, claiming I had used my professional skills to bypass the security protocols of the Vance family trust, an entity I hadn't had access to since I turned 25. He spoke about forged signatures and secret accounts, his voice rising in righteous indignation. It was a masterpiece of projection. In reality, the Vance family trust was nearly empty, drained by years of my parents' profligate spending and Chloe's failed ventures, a fact I knew because I had secretly audited the trust's public filings 6 months ago. When the call finally ended with a click that echoed through the room, Marcus leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "He knows I'm a forensic auditor, right?" he asked. "He knows that the first thing I'm going to do is verify his proof?" I nodded slowly, a small, cold smile playing at the corners of my mouth. "He thinks his status as a former client and a prominent businessman is enough to make you take his word over mine," I replied. "He doesn't realize that in this office, the only thing that matters is the ledger." I stood up, smoothing my skirt, the fabric of my suit feeling like armor. My father's attempt to ruin me was the final catalyst I needed. For years, I had stayed silent, playing the role of the dutiful, overlooked daughter while they drained the family's resources. I had watched as they took out a second mortgage on the Lake Forest house to pay for Chloe's destination wedding to a man who had since vanished with half her jewelry. I had seen the late payment notices for the country club dues tucked under piles of Architectural Digest magazines. I left Marcus's office and walked back to my own workspace, a glass-walled corner office that overlooked the Chicago River, where the murky green water flowed beneath the DuSable Bridge. I sat down at my desk and opened my personal laptop, not my work computer. I had been preparing for a day like this, though I had hoped it would never come. On my encrypted drive was a folder labeled Project Horizon. It contained 3 years of gathered data on Vance Global Logistics. I knew exactly where the bodies were buried. I knew about the $1.2 million shortfall in the employee pension fund that my father had covered up, using a predatory bridge loan from a private equity firm in the Cayman Islands. I knew about the falsified shipping manifests that exaggerated the company's quarterly earnings to keep their line of credit open with Chase Bank. And most importantly, I knew about the $450,000, the exact amount he was accusing me of stealing, that he had diverted from the company's tax escrow account to pay off Chloe's personal credit card debt and the lease on her West Loop boutique. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. He wasn't just trying to get me fired. He was trying to use me as a scapegoat for his own financial crimes. If he could convince a firm like Sterling and Associates that I was a thief, he could blame the missing funds in his own company on my supposed embezzlement. It was a classic scorched earth tactic. As I stared at the spreadsheets on my screen, the numbers glowing in the dim light of my office, I felt a profound sense of detachment. The man who had walked me down the aisle at my small, quiet wedding 3 years ago, a wedding he and my mother barely attended because it wasn't grand enough, was now trying to put me in prison to save a daughter who had never worked a day in her life. My husband, David, a public defender who saw the worst of humanity every day, had warned me that my family was a sinking ship and that they would eventually try to use me as a life raft. He was right. I spent the next 4 hours compiling a comprehensive whistleblower report. Every entry was backed by a digital receipt, a time-stamped log, or a cross-referenced bank statement. I didn't just have evidence. I had a roadmap to the total collapse of the Vance empire. I calculated the tax penalties alone to be in the range of $3 million. By the time the IRS and the Department of Labor were finished with Arthur Vance, there wouldn't be enough left of the family legacy to buy a single organic candle. I felt no guilt. Family is supposed to be the people who protect you when the world turns cold, not the people who throw you into the fire to keep themselves warm. As I prepared to hit the send button on the email to the Securities and Exchange Commission, I thought about the 2024 Maybach sitting in the driveway in Lake Forest. I thought about the way my mother had looked at me when I told her I couldn't attend Chloe's third business launch party because I had a filing deadline. "You're so selfish, Sera," she had said, her voice dripping with disappointment. "Everything is always about your work. You have no heart." Now, I was going to show them exactly what my work was worth. I was going to show them that a lead quantitative auditor doesn't just find numbers, she finds justice. I was going to burn his legacy to the ground, not out of malice, but out of a clinical necessity to balance the scales. The Vance name was about to become synonymous with fraud, and the daughter they had erased was the only one who would be left standing when the dust settled. I reached for my phone and dialed my father's private line. He picked up on the second ring, his voice smug. "Have you been fired yet, Sera?" he asked, the arrogance practically dripping through the receiver. "Not quite, Dad," I replied, my voice as cold and precise as a scalpel. "But I thought you should know that I've just finished a very thorough audit of Vance Global Logistics. You might want to check your email in about 5 minutes. There was a long silence on the other end, the sound of his heavy breathing the only noise in the air. I hung up before he could respond, the click of the phone ending our relationship forever. Family isn't blood. Family is the people who don't try to destroy you for their own convenience. And for the first time in 29 years, I was finally free of the debt of being a Vance. The financial gap between my reality and the curated illusion my family inhabited wasn't just a discrepancy in bank balances. It was a vast, echoing canyon that separated two entirely different species of existence. While I spent my nights tucked away in a cramped 550-square-foot apartment in Jersey City, a space where the radiator hissed like a dying animal and the view consisted mainly of the rusted fire escape and a sliver of the Hudson River, my sister Skylar lived a life that belonged on the cover of an architectural digest. I paid $2,450 a month for that studio, a sum that felt like a king's ransom every time the autopay hit my Chase checking account, especially since I was also meticulously paying down the final remnants of my student loans from Northwestern. To save money, I drove a used silver Subaru Impreza with 84,000 miles on the odometer and a faint scent of old upholstery that no amount of air freshener could truly mask. Every single cent of my income was logged, categorized, and analyzed in a sprawling Excel spreadsheet that I updated every evening at my kitchen island, which was actually just a repurposed IKEA desk. I knew the exact price of a gallon of milk at the local ShopRite versus the bodega on the corner, and I calculated my utility bills down to the decimal point to ensure my savings rate remained at a strict 35%. I was a lead quantitative auditor by day and a forensic accountant of my own life by night, a necessity born from the realization that if I didn't build my own floor, there would be no one to catch me when I fell. On the other side of the canyon was Skylar, who at 25 years old lived in a sprawling penthouse in Tribeca that my parents rented for a staggering $6,000 a month, a figure that didn't even include the luxury building's amenities fee or the private parking spot she used for a car she rarely drove. Skylar didn't understand the concept of a budget. To her, money was a renewable resource that simply appeared whenever she swiped her titanium credit card. She spent her afternoons floating between high-end boutiques and overpriced brunch spots, usually wearing a pair of $1,200 Balenciaga Triple S sneakers that she treated with less care than I treated my primary laptop. She hadn't worked a single day in her life, unless you counted the 3 weeks she spent as an intern at a gallery in Chelsea, where her only responsibility was choosing the playlist for the opening night and making sure the sparkling water was the correct brand of Pellegrino. My father, Harrison Vance, looked at her indolence as a sign of high status, a proof that he had reached a level of wealth where his offspring didn't need to soil their hands with labor. He spoke of her artistic temperament and her need for a creative incubator, while he dismissed my career as a mere technical trade, something respectable but ultimately middle class in spirit. The bitter irony, the secret that I had uncovered through months of careful observation and back-channel data mining, was that the gold leaf on the Vance name was peeling away to reveal a foundation of rot. My father funded Skylar's Tribeca lifestyle and my mother's penchant for vintage Chanel suits by systematically draining what he called the family trust. To the outside world, the Vance family trust was a legendary pool of old money passed down through generations of industrial success, but in reality, it was nothing more than a sophisticated shell company built on a mountain of high-interest debt and the remnants of my late grandfather's life insurance policy. My grandfather, a man who actually understood the value of a dollar and the weight of a legacy, had left behind a significant payout intended to secure the family's future for a century. Instead, Harrison had treated it like a personal lottery winning. He had leveraged the insurance money to secure massive lines of credit, using the illusion of wealth to borrow more wealth, creating a house of cards that was currently swaying in the wind of a tightening economy. He wasn't an investor or a patriarch. He was a gambler playing a desperate game of hide the marble with the IRS and a dozen private lenders. Every time I visited their home in Lake Forest or saw Skylar's social media posts featuring her latest shopping haul from Bergdorf Goodman, I saw the invisible red ink bleeding across their lives. I saw the $20,000 monthly burn rate that was being serviced by predatory bridge loans. I saw the way my father's hands would shake slightly when a courier arrived with a package that looked too much like a legal summons. He was drowning, yet he continued to throw lead weights to Skylar so she could stay afloat in her sea of silk and cashmere. When Skylar decided she wanted to launch Ethereal Glow, her organic candle business, my father didn't ask for a business plan or a market analysis. He simply reached into the dwindling coffers of the trust and handed her another $50,000 for branding and a website that looked like a fever dream of minimalist aesthetics. He expected me to do the same, to sacrifice the $82,000 I had painstakingly carved out of my own salary, because in his mind, my money was just an extension of the family's pool. He couldn't fathom that I viewed my 401k not as cash, but as my only shield against the poverty he was rapidly inviting into our lives. The discrepancy was most apparent during the holidays, when I would arrive at the Lake Forest estate in my dusty Subaru, parking it behind Skylar's pristine white Porsche Macan. My mother would kiss my cheek and immediately ask if I was still working those long hours at that little firm, as if Sterling and Associates wasn't one of the top forensic firms in the country. They looked at my thrift as a personal failing, a lack of ambition, or perhaps a sign that I wasn't truly a Vance in the way Skylar was. They wanted the prestige of my professional title, but the subservience of a dependent child. They didn't realize that the little firm had given me the tools to see through their charade. I knew that the property taxes on the Lake Forest house hadn't been paid in 2 quarters. I knew that the Maybach my father drove was technically leased through a company that was currently undergoing a forced liquidation. I sat at their dinner table, eating prime rib that was likely bought on a credit card with a 29% interest rate, and I felt a cold, clinical detachment. I was the only person in the room who knew the exact date the music would stop. Skylar would complain about the stress of finding the right shade of recycled paper for her candle packaging, and my father would nod solemnly, telling her that the Vance women were pioneers of industry. He would then turn to me and suggest that I should help my sister with her books, which was code for find a way to make her bankruptcy look like a tax deduction. When I refused, the atmosphere in the room would shift instantly from feigned warmth to icy resentment. I was the difficult one. I was the daughter who didn't understand the collective responsibility of the family. They saw my independence as a betrayal because an independent person cannot be manipulated into being a fall guy. As I drove back to Jersey City after those dinners, crossing the bridge and seeing the Manhattan skyline where Skylar's lights were burning through money I would never see, I realized that the canyon between us was unbridgeable. I didn't want their illusion. I didn't want the debt-funded sneakers or the rented penthouse. I wanted the cold, hard reality of my own making. I wanted the security of a ledger that balanced, even if the numbers were smaller. My father's attempt to brand me a thief was his final, desperate attempt to bridge that canyon by dragging me down into the abyss with him. He thought that by destroying my reputation, he could somehow validate his own financial crimes, making us all equal in our perceived dishonesty. He failed to realize that while he was a master of the shell game, I was the person who knew exactly which cup the marble was under. He had spent his life building a legacy on debt and lies, and he was about to learn that in the world of high-stakes auditing, there is no such thing as a secret that stays buried forever. The $450,000 he accused me of stealing was the weight of his own failure, and I was done carrying it for him. I was going to use my Excel sheets and my data logs to build a fortress that his lies couldn't penetrate, and I was going to watch from my 550-square-foot sanctuary as the canyon finally swallowed the Vance name whole. There is a specific kind of peace that comes with knowing the truth when everyone around you is committed to a lie. And as I sat in the dark of my Jersey City apartment that night, looking at the spreadsheet of my father's downfall, I felt more powerful than Skylar ever would in her Tribeca penthouse. The financial gap was a canyon, but I was the only one who had learned how to climb. The betrayal didn't arrive with a scream or a grand cinematic gesture. It arrived with the clinical precision of a digital timestamp, exactly at 10:14 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, while the sun was cutting sharp, geometric shapes across the plush navy carpet of Julian Sterling's executive suite. I remember the exact weight of the air in the room, heavy with the scent of expensive roasted Arabica coffee beans being ground in the break room down the hall, and the faint metallic tang of the high-end air filtration system that hummed behind the oak-paneled walls. Julian, a man whose reputation for dismantling corrupt corporate empires was as sharp as the crease in his bespoke Italian trousers, didn't say a word as he pressed the play button on his sleek silver desk phone. My father, Harrison Vance, had called Julian's private line, likely assuming that a man of Julian's stature would be easily swayed by the panicked warnings of a fellow pillar of the community who claimed to be acting out of a sense of tragic moral duty. The voice that filled the room was one I had spent 29 years trying to please, but on that recording it sounded like a stranger's, distorted by a frantic, jagged edge of desperation that he tried to mask with a tone of paternal disappointment. He spun a web of lies so intricate and so vile that for a moment the room seemed to tilt on its axis, as he claimed that I, his eldest daughter and a lead quantitative auditor with a spotless federal record, had a long-standing hidden history of kleptomania that the family had spent years covering up out of love. As the recording continued, the lies grew more monstrous and specific, shifting from vague character slurs to a direct accusation that I had systematically pilfered from my own mother's medical fund, the very money supposedly set aside for her ongoing treatments for a chronic respiratory condition. He spoke with a rehearsed tremor in his voice, telling Julian that I had used my professional knowledge of encrypted transfers to siphon away $450,000 to fund a lifestyle of hidden luxury that my Jersey City apartment and silver Subaru clearly didn't reflect. I watched the digital counter on the phone tick upward, 10:15, 10:16, while my father detailed fictional accounts of jewelry I had supposedly stolen and sold, and bank accounts I had supposedly opened in the Cayman Islands under aliases I had never heard of. It was a calculated assassination of my soul, a professional death sentence delivered by the man who had taught me how to ride a bike and how to balance my first checkbook. He thought he was playing a high-stakes game of corporate chess, believing that by preemptively branding me a thief, he could invalidate the evidence he knew I was beginning to uncover regarding the collapse of Vance Global Logistics. He didn't realize that in Julian Sterling's world, a man's word is a variable, but a spreadsheet is an absolute truth. The silence that followed the end of the voicemail was deafening, broken only by the distant chime of an elevator and the muffled honking of traffic 30 floors below on LaSalle Street. I sat perfectly still, my spine pressed against the cool leather of the guest chair, waiting for the security guards to be called or for the inevitable request for my badge and my immediate exit from the building. I looked at the steam rising from the white porcelain cup on Julian's desk, the dark liquid reflecting the overhead lights like a pool of ink. Julian didn't reach for the phone to call HR, and he didn't look at me with the disgust my father had so clearly hoped to provoke. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his hands laced behind his head, and stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the gray expanse of Lake Michigan for what felt like an eternity. When he finally turned his gaze back to me, his eyes were cold, calculating, and entirely devoid of judgment. He didn't ask me if the accusations were true, and he didn't ask for my side of the story. He simply looked at the digital recorder I had placed on his desk, the one that had captured the entire call in high-fidelity audio, and asked a single devastating question that shifted the entire landscape of our confrontation. "Sera," he said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that carried the weight of a judge's gavel, "how much of the Vance Global Ledger do we actually own through our secondary holdings and the trust's debt-to-equity swaps?" In that moment, the canyon between my father's lies and the reality of the situation was bridged by the sheer, cold power of institutional finance. Julian didn't fire me because he had already seen the preliminary audit I had filed on his secure server 3 days prior, a document that detailed the systemic embezzlement my father was committing to keep Skylar's Tribeca penthouse and the Lake Forest estate from being repossessed by the bank. My father had walked into a trap of his own making, thinking Julian was just some corporate suit who would protect his own interests by cutting ties with a problematic employee. He had failed to account for the fact that Sterling and Associates wasn't just my employer. They were the primary holders of the debt that was currently suffocating Vance Global Logistics. We didn't just work for the industry. We essentially owned the pieces of his failing legacy that hadn't already been pawned off to pay for Balenciaga sneakers and organic candle marketing. I felt a surge of adrenaline that replaced the cold hollow of betrayal, a sharp, crystalline clarity that allowed me to answer him with the precise technical data he required. "We own 42% of their primary line of credit through the acquisition of the North Shore Capital portfolio," I replied, my voice coming out stronger and more resonant than I expected. "And through the secondary market, we hold the rights to the collateral on the manufacturing plant in Gary, Indiana, which is currently valued at approximately $18 million, despite the deferred maintenance issues I've flagged in the depreciation schedules." The room felt different now, no longer a place where my character was being interrogated, but a war room where the final maneuvers of a corporate takeover were being finalized. Julian nodded slowly, a small, predatory smile tugging at the corner of his mouth as he picked up a Montblanc fountain pen and began tapping it rhythmically against his desk blotter. "Your father just handed us the ultimate leverage, Sera," he remarked, looking at the phone as if it were a weapon he had just been gifted. "By calling me and making these specific, documented accusations of financial crimes against a senior member of my staff while using the company's own recorded line, he has opened himself up to a defamation suit that would make the bankruptcy proceedings look like a minor inconvenience. But more importantly, he has admitted to the existence of the very funds we've been trying to trace for the last quarter. He says you stole $450,000 from your mother's medical trust, but we both know that money didn't go to you. It went to a holding company called Skylar Ethereal LLC to cover a lease default in Manhattan. He's not just a liar, Sera. He's a sloppy one who just provided us with the missing link in the chain of evidence." I realized then that the medical fund my father mentioned was likely the very account I had seen being depleted in $20,000 increments over the last 6 months, usually coinciding with Skylar's trips to Paris or her frequent stays at the Amman in New York. The cruelty of using my mother's health as a shield for his own fraud was a level of depravity I hadn't fully braced for, even after years of being the family's scapegoat. He was willing to paint me as a monster who would rob her own mother's life savings just to save himself from the embarrassment of a failed business venture. I looked at the silver Subaru keys sitting on the corner of the desk, a humble symbol of the life I had built for myself with honest wages and disciplined savings, and I felt a profound sense of relief. The $82,000 in my 401k that he had tried to seize was safe, but more than that, my dignity was now backed by the full weight of a multi-billion-dollar forensic firm. Julian wasn't just my boss. He was the shark that my father had accidentally invited into his own bloody waters. We spent the next 3 hours dissecting the Vance global ledger with the surgical intensity of a team of trauma surgeons. We pulled up the real-time data from the Bloomberg terminal, cross-referencing my father's desperate claims with the actual flow of capital through their primary operating accounts at Chase. We saw the red flags waving like a forest of warnings, the missed payments to the industrial suppliers, the suspicious consulting fees paid to shell companies in Delaware, and the frantic shuffling of assets between the family trust and the corporate accounts. My father thought he was protecting his legacy by attacking me, but all he had done was signal to Julian that the ship was finally sinking and that it was time to move in for the salvage operation. I worked with a cold, focused energy, my fingers flying over the keys of my laptop as I generated the final reports that would initiate the forensic freeze on his accounts. Every time I hit a key, I felt like I was reclaiming a piece of the identity he had tried to strip away from me in that 10:14 a.m. phone call. By the time the sun had shifted to the western side of the building, casting long amber shadows across the office, the strategy was set. We weren't just going to defend my name. We were going to execute a total audit that would expose every hidden debt, every forged signature, and every cent that had been stolen from the family trust to fund Skylar's illusions. Julian looked at me as I packed up my things, his expression one of professional respect. "Go home, Sera," he said softly. "Get some rest. Tomorrow morning we file the injunctions. And don't worry about the kleptomania charge. I think by the time we're done, the only thief anyone will remember in the Vance family is the one sitting in the Maybach in Lake Forest." I walked out of the Sterling and Associates building into the crisp Chicago air, the wind off the lake biting at my cheeks. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the difficult daughter or the cold sister. I felt like the person who held the keys to the kingdom, and I knew that when the music finally stopped, I would be the only one with a seat left at the table. The smell of that Arabica coffee stayed with me all the way back to Jersey City, a bitter, energizing reminder that the truth doesn't just set you free, it gives you the power to burn down the lies that tried to bury you. The clock on the dashboard of my silver Subaru flickered to 11:45 p.m., the digital numbers casting a faint, ghostly green glow over my hands as they gripped the steering wheel in the desolate silence of a parking lot off the New Jersey Turnpike. Outside, the world was a study in shadows and grit, dominated by the erratic buzzing of a cracked neon sign from a nearby 24-hour diner that bathed the asphalt in a rhythmic, nauseating pulse of crimson light. I sat there for a long time, the engine ticking as it cooled in the damp night air, feeling the weight of the day's revelations pressing against my chest like a physical burden I could no longer carry. I reached into the glove compartment, pushing aside the car's manual and a stack of old maintenance receipts, and pulled out a single, crumpled white paper napkin. With a steady hand and a black felt-tip pen I used for marking discrepancies in audit logs, I began to write down the 3 numbers that defined the architecture of my new reality, numbers that stripped away the veneer of daughterly devotion and replaced it with the cold, hard logic of a woman who had finally run out of excuses for the people who shared her DNA. The first number I scrawled across the top of the porous paper was $40 million. The current conservative valuation of Sterling and Associates, a figure that represented the sheer monolithic power of the firm Julian had built and that I had helped sustain through my years of relentless, high-stakes forensic work. This wasn't just a hypothetical market cap. It was a war chest, a testament to the fact that I was no longer a child hiding in the corners of a Lake Forest mansion, but a key architect in a financial fortress that had the capacity to crush smaller, rotting empires like Vance Global Logistics without breaking a sweat. Beneath that, I wrote 15%, a figure that would have sent my father into a catatonic state of shock if he had ever bothered to look past my used car and my small apartment to see the woman I had actually become. This was my silent equity stake in the firm, a reward Julian had granted me 2 years ago after I successfully navigated the bankruptcy of a major pharmaceutical conglomerate, a stake that meant I was technically wealthier than my father had been in a decade, even if I chose to live as though I were still scraping by. I had kept this secret hidden like a shameful wound, afraid that if my parents knew I had real power, they would find a way to monetize it, to drain it just as they had drained everything else that came within their reach. The final number, the one that felt like a hot iron pressed against the napkin, was $3.2 million, the exact amount of systematic tax fraud I had discovered in my father's personal and corporate books exactly 3 years ago. I remember the night I found it, sitting in my Jersey City apartment with a bottle of cheap wine and a stack of leaked ledger copies, feeling my stomach drop as the patterns of evasion and falsified deductions began to emerge from the chaos of his mismanagement. At the time, I had told myself it was loyalty that kept me silent, a misguided sense of familial protection that led me to bury the evidence in an encrypted drive rather than reporting it to the authorities. I had convinced myself that if I could just help him navigate the next quarter, if I could just provide enough pro bono consulting, he would find his way back to the light. But as the neon sign outside flickered and the hum of the nearby highway filled the car, I realized with a sudden bone-deep clarity that what I had called loyalty was actually a form of self-inflicted imprisonment. My father hadn't been protecting the family name or our shared history. He had been using me as a human shield for his inevitable bankruptcy, a convenient scapegoat he could discard the moment the creditors began to howl at the door. The $450,000 he had accused me of stealing in that 10:14 a.m. phone call was just a distraction, a smokescreen designed to keep the focus on a phantom theft while he tried to figure out how to pivot his $3.2 million liability onto someone else's ledger. He had looked at his eldest daughter, the one who had worked her way through night school and built a career out of thin air, and he hadn't seen a person. He had seen a contingency plan. He had seen a way to explain away the missing funds in the Vance family trust by painting me as a troubled kleptomaniac daughter whose professional greed had brought the family to ruin. He was prepared to let me go to prison, to let my career be incinerated, just so he could spend another 6 months pretending that Skylar's candle business was a success and that the Maybach in the driveway was paid for. The betrayal was so total, so absolute, that it effectively cauterized the last remaining nerves of affection I had for the man. I looked at the napkin, the ink bleeding slightly into the fibers, and I realized that the woman who had kept those secrets out of loyalty had died the moment Julian Sterling pressed play on that voicemail. I thought about the years of being the difficult daughter, the one who was criticized for her lack of style, her lack of warmth, and her refusal to participate in the vapid social theater of the Lake Forest elite. They had used my introversion and my focus as weapons against me, labeling me as cold so they didn't have to acknowledge that I was the only one in the room with eyes open. While my mother was obsessing over the color of the linens for the country club gala, and while Skylar was charging $1,200 sneakers to a trust that was essentially a corpse, I was the one who knew the exact date the foreclosure notices would arrive. I had played the role of the dutiful observer, waiting for a sign that they might actually care about the human being behind the auditor's mask, but all I had found was a void filled with debt and delusion. The realization was a liberation. If I owed them nothing, then I was finally free to use the tools they had inadvertently given me. I wasn't just a victim of their fraud. I was the most dangerous witness they could have ever created. The air in the Subaru was getting colder, and I pulled my wool coat tighter around my shoulders, the fabric smelling faintly of the Arabica coffee from Julian's office. I thought about the 15% equity I held, the silent power that gave me the standing to demand a full investigation into every entity associated with the Vance name. My father thought he was calling a corporate suit when he rang Julian, but he was actually calling my business partner, a man who viewed the Vance Global Ledger as a ripe target for a hostile takeover. By making those false accusations, my father hadn't just attacked my character. He had attacked an asset of Sterling and Associates. He had handed us the legal standing to pierce the corporate veil and look directly into the family trust, uncovering the $3.2 million fraud that I had been protecting. The irony was exquisite. By trying to ruin me to save himself, He had ensured that the one person who could have kept him out of a federal penitentiary was now the one holding the keys to his cell. I picked up the napkin and folded it neatly, tucking it into my wallet next to my corporate credit card and my driver's license. These 3 numbers were the blueprint for the coming week. Tomorrow at 8 a.m., I would sit down with Julian and the firm's lead counsel to begin the process of unraveling Harrison Vance's carefully constructed lie. We would file the defamation suit first, using the recording as irrefutable evidence, and then we would follow the trail of the missing $450,000 directly to Skylar's Manhattan boutique. But the final move, the one that would truly burn his legacy to the ground, would be the disclosure of the $3.2 million tax fraud. I would no longer be the silent daughter. I would be the primary whistleblower, providing the IRS with a decade's worth of meticulously organized data that would make their prosecution the easiest case they had ever handled. I felt no malice as I thought about this, only a profound sense of administrative necessity. A ledger that doesn't balance is a lie, and I had spent my entire life trying to make my family's numbers work when the math was fundamentally broken. As I turned the key in the ignition, the Subaru's engine hummed to life with a reassuring mechanical steadiness. I looked at the diner sign one last time, the flickering red "Eat" light reflecting off the windshield like a warning. My father had spent his life building a house of cards on a foundation of debt, believing that the Vance name was a shield that would protect him from the consequences of his own choices. He didn't understand that a name is just a string of characters on a page, and that in the end, the only thing that survives an audit is the truth. I backed out of the parking space, the tires crunching over the gravel, and began the drive back to Jersey City. The canyon between my life and theirs was now a permanent divide, a chasm that I would never attempt to cross again. I was Sera Vance, a woman with a $40 million firm behind her, a 15% stake in her own future, and a $3.2 million secret that was about to become the world's business. My father wanted a war, but he had brought a knife to a fight where I controlled the entire digital landscape. He had tried to use me as a human shield, but he had forgotten that a shield is only effective if the person holding it doesn't decide to strike back. By the time the sun rose over the Chicago skyline tomorrow, the Vance family would realize that the daughter they had erased was the only one who truly knew the value of everything they were about to lose. Family isn't blood. It isn't a trust fund or a Tudor mansion. Family is the people who don't force you to choose between your integrity and your survival. And as I reached the entrance to the turnpike, I knew that for the first time in my life, I had finally chosen myself. The next 72 hours of my life were a descent into the dark, mechanical heart of a dying empire, a period defined by the rhythmic clicking of high-speed laser printers and the suffocating, dusty scent of old paper that seemed to coat the back of my throat. To navigate this labyrinth of deceit, I enlisted the help of Elias, a forensic accountant whose reputation in the tri-state area was as formidable as his $450 hourly rate. Elias was a man who didn't believe in coincidences. He possessed a terrifyingly sharp intellect that could spot a fraudulent decimal point from across a room, and he worked with a clinical, detached efficiency that matched my own. We sequestered ourselves in a windowless war room within Sterling and Associates, a space where the only indication of the passing time was the cooling of our black coffees and the growing mountain of shredded documents in the corner. Across the expansive oak table, I finally opened what I internally called the Manila Folder of Doom, a physical manifestation of every red flag I had quietly collected over the last 3 years, but had been too paralyzed by familial loyalty to fully process. As Elias adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and began to cross-reference the digital logs with the physical evidence, the true depth of Harrison Vance's depravity began to emerge from the chaos of the numbers, like a monster rising from the deep. The core of the folder contained a chronological stack of bank statements spanning from early 2021 to late 2023, representing the systematic cannibalization of the Vance family trust. As we laid them out across the table, the patterns were unmistakable. large, round number withdrawals that coincided perfectly with my sister Skylar's social calendar, followed by frantic, high-interest bridge loans intended to mask the shortfall before the quarterly audits. But the most devastating revelation was a subfolder containing 14 distinct loan applications, each one bearing a signature that claimed to be mine. I watched Elias's face as he compared these forgeries to my actual handwriting. My father had attempted to take out personal lines of credit in my name, totaling over $600,000, effectively trying to use my credit score as a secondary furnace to keep his own house warm. The signatures were clumsy, desperate imitations of my own, a physical record of the moment my father decided that my financial survival was a fair price to pay for his continued status in Lake Forest. Each forged stroke of the pen was a betrayal that felt more intimate and more violent than the phone call he had made to Julian, because it proved that he had been planning my professional execution for years, waiting for the right moment to pull the trigger. While Elias focused on the technical discrepancies of the loans, I turned my attention to the high-resolution screenshots I had archived from the family's shared iCloud storage, a digital repository of vanity that Skylar and my mother had never bothered to secure. These images were the smoking gun of intent, featuring thread after thread of iMessage conversations where Skylar bragged to her friends about her latest shopping sprees. One screenshot, dated December 14th, showed Skylar lounging on a white sand beach in St. Bart's, holding a glass of vintage Dom Perignon with a caption that read, "Spending Dad's hush money in paradise. Don't tell the auditor's sister." The term hush money sent a chill through me, confirming that Skylar wasn't just a passive beneficiary of my father's fraud. She was a co-conspirator who understood that the funds she was using to buy $1,200 Balenciaga sneakers and fund her organic candle lifestyle were the proceeds of a crime. She viewed my hard work and my integrity as a joke, a boring obstacle to be bypassed by her father's creative accounting, and she had documented her contempt in vivid 4,000-pixel detail. The room grew colder as we reached the $3.2 million tax fraud documents, the evidence I had discovered 3 years ago and buried in a fit of misplaced daughterly devotion. Seeing them now held in Elias's gloved hands, they looked less like a secret I was keeping and more like the weapon that would finally end the Vance legacy. We found evidence of double billing, of manufacturing equipment that didn't exist being depreciated for millions, and of shell companies in Delaware that existed only to pay for the property taxes on the Lake Forest estate. My father had built a life on the assumption that no one would ever be brave enough or cold enough to look behind the curtain, and he had specifically counted on my silence as his ultimate insurance policy. As the laser printer spat out another 100 pages of cross-referenced wire transfers, the sound was like the ticking of a countdown clock. Elias looked up from a spreadsheet that detailed a series of suspicious payments to a consultant who turned out to be my mother's interior designer and sighed, a sound of pure professional exhaustion. "Your father didn't just break the law, Sera. He treated the tax code like a suggestion box," Elias remarked, his voice echoing in the small room. "He's been operating on a deficit of character for so long that he's actually forgotten what a real asset looks like." I sat there, staring at the screenshot of Skylar in St. Bart's, and I felt the last lingering threads of my old life snap. For 29 years, I had been the girl who stayed late to fix the mistakes, the girl who lived in a small apartment while her sister lived in a penthouse, and the girl who accepted the label of being cold because it was easier than admitting I was being excluded. Now, I was the woman with the Manila Folder of Doom, the only person who could speak the language of the truth in a family that had been speaking the language of the lie for decades. I realized that the $450,000 theft my father had accused me of was actually the exact amount he had diverted to cover a botched real estate deal in Chicago, a debt he had tried to pin on me to avoid a personal bankruptcy filing. He had calculated the cost of my life and found it to be less than the value of his own reputation. Every hour that passed in that room with Elias, at $450 an hour, was an investment in my own liberation. We weren't just preparing a defense. We were preparing a total scorched earth offensive that would leave the Vance name in ruins. By the end of the 72 hours, the table was no longer visible beneath the sheer volume of evidence. We had mapped every cent, identified every forged document, and cataloged every boastful text message. The paper was no longer just old records. It was the fuel for the fire I was about to light. I looked at the clock, seeing that it was nearly 3 a.m. on Friday morning, and I felt a strange, crystalline peace. I thought about the $82,000 in my 401k, a sum that seemed so small compared to the millions my father had squandered. But it was mine, and it was honest. My father had tried to take that from me too, but in doing so, he had forced me to open the one folder he should have prayed stayed closed forever. Family isn't blood, and it certainly isn't a shared cloud storage account filled with evidence of betrayal. Family is the people who don't try to take loans in your name while you're sleeping. As I gathered the papers and placed them back into the manila folder, I knew that the next time my father heard my voice, it wouldn't be as a daughter pleading for his approval. It would be as the lead quantitative auditor who was about to show the world exactly how much a Vance legacy is worth when it's finally properly audited. The scent of old paper and laser printers followed me out into the cool night air of Chicago, a bitter but necessary reminder that the truth is a heavy thing, but it's the only thing that doesn't burn when the world goes up in flames. The trap was set with the kind of opulent, gilded precision that my father, Harrison Vance, had always mistaken for true power, situated within the grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel on East 61st Street, where the air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies, floor wax, and the desperate, cloying perfume of old money trying to ignore the stench of its own decay. There were 85 guests in total, a sea of midnight blue tuxedos and silk floor-length gowns from designers like Oscar de la Renta and Vera Wang, all gathered for the Vance Global Investor Appreciation Dinner, an event that was ostensibly a celebration of another year of manufacturing excellence, but was in reality a funeral for a legacy that had already flatlined. They were dining on $200 per plate A5 Japanese Wagyu beef served on gold-rimmed bone china, sipping vintage 2012 Dom Perignon that flowed as freely as the lies my father had been telling for 3 decades. My father sat at the head table, flanked by my mother Madeline, who looked brittle in her emerald-cut diamonds, and my sister Skylar, who was radiant in a $4,000 silk slip dress, her eyes scanning the room for the next person she could impress with her proximity to supposed wealth. My father was basking in the warm, artificial glow of a $500,000 investment check he believed he was receiving from Julian Sterling tonight, a lifeline he thought would finally bridge the gap in his embezzled escrow accounts and silence the creditors who had been circling his Lake Forest estate like vultures. I arrived at exactly 8:32 p.m., the heavy brass and glass doors of the Pierre swinging open as I stepped into the foyer, feeling the immediate contrast between the humid New York night and the chilled, filtered air of the hotel. I wasn't wearing a gown or carrying a clutch filled with lipstick and vanity. I was wearing a sharp, charcoal black Giorgio Armani power suit that had cost me exactly 3 months of disciplined savings, its lines so precise and severe that it felt like a suit of armor designed for a corporate battlefield. My heels, black leather Prada pumps that clicked with a rhythmic, lethal cadence against the marble floor, announced my presence before I even reached the ballroom threshold. I didn't stop at the bar for a glass of champagne, and I didn't offer a polite smile to the greeters who recognized me as the difficult Vance daughter. In my hand, I carried a professional leather briefcase, and inside that briefcase was the weight of 1,000 secrets, a stack of 100 brushed aluminum USB drives, each one containing the high-definition digital truth of the Vance global collapse, the 14 forged signatures, the $3.2 million tax fraud, and the screenshots of Skylar's St. Bart's indulgence funded by my mother's medical trust. As I entered the ballroom, the crystal chandeliers overhead seemed to hum with a low-frequency vibration that matched the buzzing in my own veins. a surge of adrenaline that was cold, calculated, and entirely devoid of the fear that had defined my life for 29 years. I saw Julian Sterling standing near the stage, looking every bit the high-stakes executioner in his bespoke tuxedo, his eyes meeting mine for a fraction of a second with a look of grim, professional acknowledgement. He knew the play. He had spent the last hour playing the role of the generous benefactor, letting my father brag about expanding the manufacturing footprint while Julian watched the clock, waiting for me to deliver the killing blow. My father spotted me across the room, and his face momentarily clouded with a mixture of annoyance and confusion, likely wondering why his kleptomaniac daughter had the audacity to show up to his night of triumph in a suit that looked more expensive than her entire Subaru. He hadn't yet realized that the suit wasn't an aesthetic choice. It was a uniform. He waved a dismissive hand toward me, signaling for me to stay in the periphery, but I didn't move toward the bar or the appetizers. I walked directly toward the center of the room, cutting through the clusters of socialites and hedge fund managers like a scalpel through soft tissue. The sounds of the room, the clinking of silverware against fine china, the practiced laughter of women who had never known a day of labor, and the deep, resonant booming of my father's voice as he told a story about his late father, all seemed to fade into a dull, distant roar as I reached the first table of investors. I reached into my briefcase and began placing the USB drives on the white linen tablecloths, one by one, right next to the dessert spoons and the half-empty wine glasses. I moved with a mechanical, eerie efficiency, not saying a word as I distributed the digital bombs. I watched as people picked them up, turning the silver drives over in their hands, their faces reflecting the flickering candlelight as they saw the small, printed labels I had attached to each one. The Vance Global Audit. Confidential. The confusion started at the back of the room and moved forward like a slow-motion wave, a ripple of quiet whispers and pointed fingers that eventually caught the attention of the head table. My mother's hand went to her throat, her diamonds catching the light as she realized that the difficult daughter was no longer playing the part of the silent observer. My father stood up, his face flushing a dangerous shade of purple that clashed with his silk tie, his chair scraping loudly against the parquet floor. "Sera, what on earth are you doing?" he barked, his voice projecting across the ballroom and silencing the band that had been playing a soft jazz rendition of a classic Broadway tune. "This is an invitation-only event for our partners, not a place for your theatrics." I didn't stop until I was standing 10 feet from him, the last USB drive gripped between my thumb and forefinger. I looked at him, and for the first time in my life, I didn't see a patriarch or a titan of industry. I saw a small, frightened man who was drowning in a sea of his own making. "I'm not here as your daughter, Harrison," I said, my voice amplified by the sudden, expectant silence of the 85 guests who were now staring at us with the morbid curiosity of people watching a car crash. "I am here as a lead quantitative auditor and a minority partner of Sterling & Associates. And because I am a fiduciary for many of the people in this room, I cannot allow them to invest another cent into a company that is currently a smoking crater of tax fraud and embezzlement." The silence that followed was so absolute that I could hear the faint whirring of the hotel's HVAC system. My father's jaw dropped, his eyes darting toward Julian, who was now stepping onto the stage, not to hand over a check, but to take the microphone. Julian didn't look at my father. He looked at the room. "We would like to thank Mr. Vance for hosting such a lovely dinner," Julian began, his voice smooth and devoid of any warmth. "However, in light of the forensic evidence just distributed by Ms. Vance, Sterling & Associates is officially withdrawing our investment offer and initiating a full liquidation protocol on the Vance global debt we currently hold. I recommend everyone here take a very close look at the files on those drives. You will find that the $500,000 you thought was going toward expansion was actually diverted yesterday to cover a private debt in Manhattan associated with a boutique called Ethereal Glow." My sister Skylar let out a sharp, strangled gasp, her hand flying to her mouth as the room erupted into a cacophony of shouting and chair legs dragging across the floor. I watched as the investors, the very people my father had spent months wooing with Wagyu and vintage wine, scrambled to find their phones, their faces pale as they realized their money was being used to fund candle shops and Balenciaga sneakers. My father tried to step toward me, his hands shaking with a rage that was quickly being eclipsed by pure, unadulterated terror. "You're lying!" he screamed, though the words sounded hollow even to him. "You stole that money! You're the thief!" But nobody was looking at him anymore. They were looking at the screens of the laptops that a few of the more tech-savvy younger associates had already pulled out, the forged signatures appearing in high resolution on their displays like the marks of a guilty man. The trap hadn't just been set. It had snapped shut with a finality that made the air in the room feel heavy with the weight of justice. I stood my ground, my black Armani suit uncreased, my spine straight, and my heart beating with a rhythm that was finally, after 29 years, my own. The Pierre Hotel's security staff began to move toward the head table, not to protect my father, but because Julian had already alerted the authorities and the hotel management that a high-value financial fraud was being exposed in real time. My mother began to cry, a quiet, sobbing sound that was lost in the roar of the crowd, while Skylar simply sat there, staring at the empty space where her future used to be. I turned my back on them, not out of cruelty, but because I was finished with the ledger of their lives. I walked out of the ballroom exactly 15 minutes after I had arrived, the stack of 100 USB drives replaced by a profound, echoing sense of freedom. I had spent my life as a human shield for their bankruptcy of character. But tonight, I had put the shield down and walked into the light. Behind me, the Vance legacy was being torn apart by the very people who had built it. And as I stepped out onto East 61st Street and hailed a cab, the cool night air felt like a benediction. The audit was over, the numbers finally balanced, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't just Sera Vance, the difficult daughter. I was the woman who had survived the crash. Family isn't blood, and it isn't a gold-rimmed plate of Wagyu beef. Family is the truth that remains when all the gold leaf has been stripped away, and as the taxi pulled away from the Pierre, I realized that the only person I needed to belong to was myself. "Attention, everyone," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy, champagne-soaked atmosphere of the Pierre Hotel's grand ballroom with the chilling resonance of a funeral bell as I stepped up to the mahogany podium and adjusted the high-fidelity Shure microphone. The room, which only moments ago had been a cacophony of elite laughter and the clinking of gold-rimmed glassware, fell into a vacuum of absolute silence so profound that the only audible sound was the sharp, metallic clatter of a silver spoon hitting a porcelain bowl at a table in the third row. I stood there, bathed in the harsh, unforgiving spotlight of the crystal chandeliers, feeling the cool weight of my charcoal Armani suit against my skin, and looking directly at the head table where the man who had raised me sat frozen in a tableau of rising panic. My father had told my boss, Julian Sterling, that I was a common embezzler, a kleptomaniac who would rob her own mother's medical trust to fund a phantom lifestyle, and he had done so with the smug confidence of a man who believed his status was an impenetrable shield. So I decided to do exactly what I have been trained to do better than anyone else in this industry. I performed a total scorched earth audit of the Vance family legacy. I didn't wait for him to respond or for the security guards to reach the stage. Instead, I gave a sharp, imperceptible nod to the AV tech crew behind the velvet curtains, 3 young men whom I had tipped $500 in cash earlier that evening to ensure that my digital presentation took precedence over the scheduled promotional video for Vance Global Logistics. The massive, high-definition projector screen lowered from the ceiling with a mechanical whir, and as I hit the final command on my wireless remote, the room was illuminated by the cold, blue light of 1,000 spreadsheets. The giant projector didn't show the expected marketing graphs or images of manufacturing plants. It displayed the intricate, jagged architecture of my father's secret offshore accounts, including a primary entity registered in the British Virgin Islands that Harrison Vance thought was invisible to the American tax authorities. The silence in the ballroom shifted from curiosity to a collective, horrified gasp as the first slide detailed the $2.1 million he had laundered over the last 24 months through Skylar's Ethereal Glow business account. The data was undeniable, presented in the high-resolution clarity of forensic accounting software, showing the direct wire transfers from the Vance Family Trust into a series of shell companies that ultimately paid for Skylar's $6,000 a month Tribeca penthouse, her $1,200 Balenciaga sneakers, and her frequent five-figure shopping sprees at Bergdorf Goodman. My father's face, which had been flushed with the pride of a successful host, turned a sickly, bruised color of raw liver as he watched his secret life being deconstructed in front of 85 of his most influential peers and creditors. He tried to stand, his hands fumbling with the heavy damask napkin in his lap, but the sheer weight of the evidence seemed to pin him to his seat. Skylar, sitting to his right in her $4,000 silk slip dress, opened her mouth to let out a piercing scream of indignation, but the sound died in her throat as she realized the room was no longer looking at the screen. They were looking at their own laps. While I had been speaking, the realization had begun to spread through the ballroom like a contagion. I had instructed the catering staff, under the guise of a special investor surprise, to place a sealed, high-density manila envelope under the base of every single dinner plate before the Wagyu beef was served. As I stood at the podium, 85 pairs of hands reached down, lifting the heavy porcelain to reveal the printed bank logs, forged loan documents, and sworn affidavits that I had spent the last 72 hours compiling with Elias. The sound of 100 envelopes being torn open simultaneously was like a wave of static, followed by the heavy silence of 85 people reading the cold, hard truth of how their investments had been systematically pilfered to maintain the Vance family's crumbling facade. I watched as a prominent hedge fund manager at the front table looked at a photocopy of his own forged signature on a secondary bridge loan and turned to glare at my father with a look of predatory fury that no lawyer could ever mitigate. The hyper-realistic detail of the audit was staggering. I had included the 2024 black Chevrolet Tahoe High Country lease agreements, the receipts for the $3.2 million tax evasion scheme, and the exact timestamps of the iCloud messages where Skylar joked about spending her mother's respiratory treatment funds on a yacht in St. Bart's. This wasn't just an accusation, it was a digital execution. I remained at the microphone, my expression as flat and clinical as a ledger, watching as the man who had tried to destroy my career to save his own reputation realized that he had inadvertently invited the executioner to his final meal. The air in the grand ballroom was now thick with the smell of the $200 per plate beef cooling on the plates, ignored by guests who were realizing they were sitting in the middle of a federal crime scene. My mother, Madeline, sat with her head bowed, the emerald-cut diamonds at her throat looking like cold green ice in the projector's glare, as she realized that the difficult daughter she had spent years dismissing was the only person in the room who truly understood the value of the Vance name. Exactly zero. Every cent was accounted for, every lie was documented, and every forged signature was highlighted in neon red on the giant screen behind me. My father's attempt to brand me a thief was the final catalyst that allowed me to pierce the corporate veil and show these investors that their money wasn't in manufacturing plants or logistics networks. It was in the silk threads of Skylar's wardrobe and the fuel tanks of a Maybach that was about to be repossessed. I saw Julian Sterling sitting at his table, a faint, grim smile of professional satisfaction on his face as he watched the total collapse of the Vance empire, a collapse he had authorized and I had executed. I was no longer the daughter who drove a silver Subaru and lived in a 550-square-foot apartment out of a sense of shame. I was the lead quantitative auditor who had just balanced the most important ledger of her life. The security guards at the Pierre, sensing the shift in the room from a celebratory dinner to a potential riot, began to form a perimeter around the head table, but it wasn't to protect my father from the law. It was to protect him from the angry investors who were now standing up, their voices rising in a crescendo of demands for their capital. My father looked up at me, his eyes pleading for a mercy I no longer possessed, but I didn't offer him a single word of comfort. I had spent 29 years seeking his approval, only to realize that the only person whose approval mattered was the woman who had the courage to look at a mountain of lies and find the truth buried at the bottom. The projector continued to cycle through the evidence, a relentless slideshow of financial depravity that left no room for doubt or defense. I had burned his legacy to the ground, but I hadn't used a torch. I had used the truth, and in the world of high-stakes finance, the truth is the most flammable substance known to man. As the first of the police officers and IRS special agents, whom Julian had alerted hours ago, appeared at the back of the ballroom, their dark windbreakers a stark contrast to the tuxedos and gowns, I stepped down from the podium. I didn't look back at the Wagyu beef or the vintage champagne. I walked through the crowd of stunned socialites, my black Armani suit cutting a path through the chaos, and felt a sense of lightness that I hadn't known since I was a child. The audit was complete, the numbers were final, and the debt of being a Vance had been paid in full by the very person they had tried to erase. Family isn't blood. Family is the people who don't force you to forge your own name to survive, and as I walked out of the Pierre and into the cool, dark New York night, I knew that the only thing I was taking with me was my integrity and the knowledge that I had finally, permanently, cleared my own name. The silver spoon on the porcelain bowl had been the last sound of the old world, and now the only thing left was the silence of a truth that no amount of money could ever buy back. By 9 a.m. the following morning, the world that Harrison Vance had spent decades constructing out of borrowed capital and borrowed time didn't just crack. It vanished into the gray, humid New York air with the clinical finality of a forced liquidation. The SEC, accompanied by investigators from the Department of Justice and a phalanx of special agents from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, arrived at the mahogany double doors of the Lake Forest estate before the morning dew had even evaporated from the manicured lawn. They weren't there for a social call, and they certainly weren't there to listen to my father's practiced explanations about cash flow timing or the temporary nature of his manufacturing deficits. They came with federal warrants, their black windbreakers a grim contrast to the Tudor architecture, and they began the methodical process of seizing every digital server, every file cabinet, and the keys to the 2024 Mercedes Maybach that sat like a silent witness in the driveway. By noon, the frozen assets order had been signed by a federal judge, effectively turning the Vance global empire into a static list of liabilities and evidence. My father didn't just lose the house he had built on the backs of his employees' pension funds. He lost the very air he breathed, the reputation of a titan that had allowed him to walk into any country club in the state and be treated like royalty. The fall was absolute, a vertical drop from the heights of the Pierre Hotel's grand ballroom into the cold, fluorescent reality of a federal interrogation room where the only currency that mattered was a truth he no longer knew how to tell. The collapse extended its reach to the Tribeca penthouse where my sister Skylar had lived her life in a perpetual state of silk-lined denial. Within 48 hours of the audit going public, the management of the luxury building, having seen the headlines in the Wall Street Journal regarding the Vance fraud, initiated an immediate eviction for the unpaid $6,000 monthly rent that my father had been covering with laundered funds. Skylar, who had never known the weight of a laundry basket or the stress of a grocery budget, found herself standing on the sidewalk of West Broadway surrounded by designer luggage she could no longer afford to fill. The transition was a brutal exercise in hyper-realism. The $1,200 Balenciaga sneakers were eventually traded for a pair of sensible work shoes, as she was forced to move into a 300-square-foot studio apartment in a dilapidated section of Queens, sharing the cramped space with a roommate she met on a frantic Craigslist search. The woman who once complained about the quality of organic wax in her candle boutique was now clocking in for graveyard shifts at a 7-Eleven on the corner of 31st Street, earning exactly $15 an hour, plus a meager shift differential. She spent her nights stocking shelves with generic snacks and mopping floors that smelled of industrial cleaner and spilled coffee, a far cry from the scent of expensive lilies at the Pierre. Every time she processed a transaction for a $5 lottery ticket, she was reminded that her entire life had been a gamble that her father had finally lost. As for me, I didn't stay to watch the wreckage burn. I was too busy building the foundation of what came next. After the dust settled on the federal indictments, Julian Sterling did something that no one in the Vance family could have predicted. He didn't just keep me on as a lead quantitative auditor, he officially reorganized the firm's hierarchy to recognize the person who had actually saved the company's reputation from being dragged down by the Vance debt. I am now a full equity partner at the renamed Sterling & Vance, a firm that has become the gold standard for forensic integrity in the post-Vance era. My new office isn't a cramped space in Jersey City or a windowless room filled with the scent of old paper. It is a sprawling executive suite on the top floor of a glass tower in Lower Manhattan, where the floor-to-ceiling windows offer a breathtaking, unobstructed view of the Statue of Liberty standing tall against the horizon of the harbor. Every morning, I sit at my desk, a custom-carved piece of slate that feels as solid as my new life, and I look out at that statue, a reminder that independence isn't something that is given to you by your parents. It is something you have to audit, verify, and claim for yourself. The final piece of business I had to attend to was a ghost from my past that still tried to haunt the margins of my new reality. 2 weeks after the conviction of Harrison Vance on charges of wire fraud, tax evasion, and identity theft, I received a frantic, handwritten letter from his defense attorney, a man who was clearly struggling to find any mitigating factors for a client who had tried to frame his own daughter. The letter spoke of family reconciliation, of the healing power of forgiveness, and hinted that my father wanted me to testify as a character witness during his sentencing phase to help reduce his 15-year federal prison term. I didn't even finish reading the second paragraph. I sat down at my computer and composed one final clinical email to his legal counsel, an email that contained the same precision I applied to a multi-million-dollar ledger. "The audit is closed," I wrote, the words appearing on the screen in a stark black font. "The Vance family accounts have been settled in full, and there is no remaining balance of loyalty or obligation. Do not contact me again, professionally or personally." I hit the send button without a moment of hesitation, feeling the final tether to my childhood snap with a quiet digital click. I am no longer the daughter who hides her 401k out of fear, or the woman who accepts the labels of cold and difficult as insults. I have realized that being cold is simply another way of saying I am unmoved by manipulation, and being difficult is just the word people use for a woman they can no longer control. My silver Subaru has been replaced by a black 2025 Audi e-tron GT, a car that reflects the quiet, electric power of a life built on honest math and unwavering boundaries. I still keep my Excel sheets, and I still track my expenses with a meticulous eye, but I no longer do it out of a sense of survival. I do it because I respect the value of what I have built. I am Sera Vance, 30 years old, a partner in a global firm, and the architect of my own liberation. The $3.2 million fraud that my father thought would be his salvation became the catalyst for my own ascension, proving that in the end, the truth is the only asset that doesn't depreciate over time. Looking back, the 10:14 a.m. phone call on that Tuesday morning wasn't a betrayal. It was a graduation. It was the moment I was forced to stop being a daughter and start being a professional, the moment I stopped looking for love in a ledger that was filled with red ink. My mother still sends the occasional text message, usually asking for money to cover her medical expenses, which we both know are actually legal fees, but I have blocked her number with the same clinical efficiency I used to block my father's offshore accounts. I have learned that family isn't blood, and it isn't a shared name on a Tudor mansion. Family is the people who stay when the truth comes out, the people who don't ask you to forge your own signature to save their pride. Julian Sterling, Elias, and the team at my firm are my family now, people who value my mind, my ethics, and my presence without requiring a human shield for their own failures. As the sun sets over the Hudson River, casting long golden shadows across my office and illuminating the Statue of Liberty in a brilliant, fiery orange. I feel a sense of peace that is deeper than any inheritance could ever provide. I have cleared my name, I have protected my future, and I have shown the world that the most dangerous person you can ever encounter is an auditor who has nothing left to lose but her integrity. The Vance name will eventually be forgotten, a footnote in the history of Midwestern manufacturing fraud, but the work I do here will endure. I have learned to live in the hyper-realistic light of the present, where the numbers never lie and the view is finally, clearly mine. My story isn't a tragedy of a family lost. It is a triumph of a woman found. The audit is closed, the books are balanced, and for the first time in 30 years, the ledger of my life is finally in the black. There is a specific, quiet power in knowing that you owe no one anything. And as I close my laptop and prepare to leave my office for the night, I realize that the most valuable thing I ever discovered in my father's books wasn't the fraud. It was the strength to walk away from it. I am no longer a Vance in the way they wanted me to be. I am a Vance in the way they feared I would become. The one who finally, permanently, told the truth.